In the hushed darkness of the medieval home, where candlelight trembled against rough stone walls and prayers floated like whispers into the night, childbirth was not a moment of joy but a ritual of survival. To be pregnant in the Middle Ages was to live each day with one foot already planted in the grave. For every woman who carried new life, there was the silent acknowledgement that her own might be extinguished in the process. It is said that many prepared their wills before the pangs of labor even began, writing down their last words, arranging guardians for children who might soon be motherless, and confessing sins to priests so that their souls would not be caught unready when the moment came. Unlike today, where pregnancy often carries images of glowing expectation, in those centuries it was an ordeal so dangerous that women walked toward the birthing chamber as if walking into a battlefield, armed not with medicine, but with faith, charms, and sheer will to endure. When the first tightening of pain gripped her body, a woman was led into a small, enclosed chamber sealed off from the outside world, a place where only women could enter. Husbands, no matter their status, no matter their knowledge, were forbidden to cross the threshold. Midwives, neighbors, and female relatives surrounded the laboring woman, creating a circle of breathless anticipation. The walls themselves seemed to absorb the fear and prayers spoken within. Holy relics might be placed on the bed, strips of parchment covered in sacred words tied around the laboring mother's body, birthing girdles laid across her belly in desperate hope that divine power might succeed where human hands failed. They whispered invocations to Saint Margaret, the patron saint of childbirth, pleading for her protection, begging her to open the womb, to shield both mother and child from the shadows lurking in that room. But no saint could always intervene, and the dangers were merciless. The great killers of childbirth haunted every moment, bleeding that poured life away within hours, infections that crept invisibly into torn flesh, and the silent, suffocating horror of obstructed labor when the baby would not descend. Imagine the agony of a woman enduring days of wrenching, relentless pain, her body straining against an impossible barrier, while the midwives could do nothing but watch helplessly as both mother and child slipped slowly toward death. Caesarean sections, if attempted, were almost always fatal for the mother, performed only as a desperate measure to save the infant when her life was already lost. What medicine could not heal, superstition tried to answer. Words of power, whispered prayers, and ritual acts filled the air, yet the outcome was often the same: another life gone, another family broken, and still they endured. Women knew what awaited them, yet they walked willingly into that room because society demanded it, faith encouraged it, and the continuation of family lines depended on it. Diaries and letters from the time speak of mothers who prayed not for a healthy, beautiful child, but for the simplest of mercies. Lord, let me live to see my baby's face. Survival, not joy, was the greatest blessing a mother could hope for. Imagine the cruel tension in those words, how different from today's celebrations, how starkly shaped by the shadows of mortality that pressed against every cradle. The birthing chamber itself was a world apart, both sacred and terrifying. Windows were covered, light dimmed, for it was believed the atmosphere of birth should remain closed and hidden from prying eyes and evil spirits. Women surrounded the mother, offering herbs, warm cloths, whispered encouragement, and at times physical force to press upon her belly or pull the child forth with their hands. The screams, the sweat, the smell of blood and candle wax mixed into an atmosphere thick with fear. Outside the room, husbands waited in silent dread, listening for the first cries of a child, but knowing those cries might be followed by the toll of a church bell marking another death. For all the dangers, medieval society cloaked childbirth in ritual and mysticism. Birthing girdles covered in scripture were worn like armor, believed to shield both body and soul. Crosses were hung in corners, charms were tied to wrists, and certain words were never spoken aloud for fear of drawing misfortune. It was not merely a medical event, it was a spiritual trial, a battle fought between the forces of life and death with the mother's body as the battlefield. If she emerged alive, she was considered reborn, purified by suffering. If she died, it was whispered that her soul had been tested by God himself. Yet what is perhaps most haunting is how ordinary death in childbirth became. It was not an aberration, but an expectation. The statistics 1 to 5 women lost for every 100 births meant that everyone knew someone who had died this way. Every family bore scars, every child had heard the weeping of a father who buried a wife too soon. Every husband knew the hollow fear of losing the woman he loved in exchange for the child she bore. And yet life pressed forward, because it had to. Women continued to step into that room, because the cycle of birth and death was unbreakable, each generation bound by the same peril. To imagine this world is to imagine a reality where joy was always edged with terror. The laughter of a newborn was a miracle purchased at terrible risk, and every cradle rocked in the shadow of the grave. Even the church acknowledged the danger, crafting prayers specifically for women in labor, prayers not of celebration but of protection. And when a mother did not survive, there were rites and rituals for her too, woven into the cycle of faith that governed every breath of medieval life. The child she left behind carried both her legacy and her silence, a reminder of the cost of life in an age before medicine could offer hope. And so, the story of medieval childbirth is not merely about suffering, it is about endurance, sacrifice, and the fragile thread of life stretched to its breaking point. It forces us to confront the reality that what we take for granted today was once the most perilous gamble a woman could make. The birthing chamber was not only a place of beginnings, but a place where mortality itself lingered, waiting to claim its share. In every groan of pain, in every whispered prayer, in every flicker of candlelight over a pale, exhausted face, history whispers the truth. Motherhood was once not just about giving life, but about facing death with unflinching. When the cries of a newborn finally pierced the silence, they did not always mean relief. Sometimes the infant emerged limp, blue, or lifeless, and the exhausted mother, still bleeding, still trembling from hours of torment, would watch as midwives scrambled to revive the child with crude methods, rubbing salt on its skin, blowing air into its mouth, or dunking it in cold water. For the mother, there was no pause, no chance to rest, for danger did not end with birth. It lingered in the shadows of the hours and days that followed, when fevers crept into the body and infections slowly poisoned the blood. The dreaded childbed fever, a name that echoes across centuries, claimed thousands of lives long after the pain of labor had passed. A woman who thought she had survived the ordeal could collapse days later, her body racked with chills and burning with fever, her family watching helplessly as she slipped away. The cruelest irony was that often, it was not fate or divine judgment, but the very hands that helped deliver her child that spread the infection. In an age without understanding of germs, without hand-washing, midwives would move from one birth to the next, carrying unseen death beneath their nails. Superstition grew to fill the void where knowledge failed. Women were told that certain foods or behaviors during pregnancy would decide the child's fate or their own. Eating hare meat could give the baby a hare lip. Conceiving during certain phases of the moon might create a weak or cursed child. If labor dragged on too long, neighbors whispered that someone had cast an evil spell, binding the womb shut. Witches were blamed for obstructed births, demons for stealing infants from the cradle, and divine wrath for striking down mothers who had lived impure lives. Midwives themselves were often trapped between necessity and suspicion, revered for their skills but feared for their secret knowledge. In later centuries, when witch hunts swept across Europe, countless midwives were accused of sorcery, tortured, and executed, punished for the very skills that once made them essential. The birthing chamber, already a place of peril, became even darker when suspicion turned it into a site of accusation and fear. And for the women, there was no choice but to endure. Society judged them not only by their survival but by their fertility. A noble woman's worth was measured in heirs, her body treated as a vessel for lineage, her survival secondary to the continuation of her husband's name. If she died, another wife would be sought, another womb pressed into service. For peasant women, childbirth meant more mouths to feed, more hands to work the fields, but the same deadly risks, multiplied with each pregnancy. Imagine a life where the average woman might bear 8, 10, or even 12 children, with death shadowing each labor, a relentless gamble repeated again and again. Every birth was both a triumph and a sentence, leaving scars both visible and invisible. Even when mother and child survived, the ordeal did not end in joy alone. There were customs to purify the mother, for medieval society viewed childbirth as something dangerous not just to the body but to the soul. The blood of labor was seen as unclean, the process itself as tainted by sin and suffering. Women were expected to undergo a ritual of churching, a formal re-entry into the religious community after giving birth. Until then, she was considered impure, marked by the shadow of her ordeal. Imagine the weight of this belief. The very act that risked her life to create new life left her spiritually stained until cleansed by ceremony. It was as though the pain was not enough, even survival came with the stigma of impurity. And yet, amidst the fear and suffering, there were small acts of tenderness. A mother clutching her newborn, whispering prayers of gratitude through cracked lips. Women singing softly to drown out screams, weaving lullabies into the air thick with blood and incense. Families naming their children after saints in hopes of divine protection. Even in the darkest corners of history, love fought to bloom against the shadows. But the truth remains, stark and haunting. Motherhood in the medieval world was a test of mortality, and too often the price of giving life was death itself. If we step back and see this world through the lens of history, the image is chilling. Entire generations born into a cycle where childbirth was one of the leading causes of death for women, where medicine had no answers, where faith was both the only remedy and the only comfort. The miracle of life was bound inseparably to the specter of death, and the cradle and coffin stood side by side in countless homes. To us, it may seem unimaginable, but to them, it was reality, the constant knowledge that every pregnancy might be their last, and that the joy of new life could be shattered by the tolling of a funeral bell. There is a silence that lingers in the stories of medieval childbirth, a silence louder than screams, the silence of the women who did not live to tell their tale. For every chronicle written by priests, for every record kept by kings, there are countless voices erased, buried in the earth alongside the infants who never took a breath, and yet their absence speaks volumes. Their fate was not rare, not unusual, but a thread woven through every village, every castle, every family tree. The graveyards of Europe are filled with young mothers whose names faded quickly from memory, their only legacy the children who survived during the empty cradles left behind. When we look back at history, we often see kings, warriors, battles, and empires, but behind those stories lies another empire, built on the pain of women whose blood watered the soil of the Middle Ages. For noble women, the burden was perhaps heaviest. Their wombs were dynasties, their bodies pawns in political games where an heir could decide the fate of kingdoms. Queens and princesses faced the same risks as peasants, yet their deaths could ripple across nations. Consider the countless royal women who entered marriage knowing their value was measured only in children. Some bore one heir and never emerged from the chamber again. Others endured repeated labors, their bodies breaking down, until death finally claimed them. And yet their stories were often reduced to a line in a genealogy: "She died in childbed." Behind those words lie nights of agony, screams muffled by stone walls, prayers whispered in candlelight, and the cold indifference of history recording the outcome but never the suffering. Among peasants, childbirth was no less perilous but far less recorded. Their stories live only in folklore, in scraps of prayer books, in the whispered tales of midwives who carried both knowledge and fear. A mother in a small village might labor in a smoky cottage, the air thick with incense meant to ward off evil spirits, while neighbors stood outside listening, wondering if both mother and child would live until dawn. If she died, the community mourned, but life moved on swiftly. Another woman would step into her role, another womb would continue the cycle. The personal tragedies of the poor rarely made it into chronicles, yet they outnumbered the tragedies of queens 1,000-fold. It is easy to imagine the fear that gripped women from their first quickening, the first flutter of life in their bellies, knowing it might also be the seed of their death. Imagine carrying that knowledge for 9 long months, watching your body change, preparing not only for motherhood but for possible departure from this world. It shaped their prayers, their confessions, even their relationships. Husbands and wives lived with the quiet knowledge that each pregnancy might end in parting. Some letters from the time show men writing to their pregnant wives with tenderness, others with resignation, as though already preparing for loss. This shared awareness gave childbirth not only a physical danger but a psychological weight that shadowed entire households. Even the church, which sanctified motherhood, could not erase the grim truth. It offered saints, relics, and rituals, but it also reinforced the idea that suffering in childbirth was punishment for your sin. Women were told that their agony was the price of humanity's fall, a divine decree written into flesh. Every contraction, every tear, every scream was framed as a spiritual test. To endure was to obey God's will, to die was to be welcomed into His mercy. In this way, faith became both comfort and a cruel reminder that their suffering was considered natural, even necessary. But not all rituals were holy. In desperate times, families turned to charms, amulets, and forbidden practices. Some burned herbs and whispered incantations to speed labor. Others placed knives beneath the bed to cut the pain, or tied magical knots that could be undone to ease the womb's opening. In remote villages, pagan traditions mingled with Christian rites, creating a strange fusion of prayer and sorcery. While some saw these practices as harmless, others feared them as witchcraft. The line between healing and heresy was thin, and a midwife who relied too heavily on charms might one day find herself accused before inquisitors, her skills transformed in the eyes of the church into evidence of a pact with the devil. The echoes of this suffering stretch beyond the Middle Ages. Even in later centuries, long after the medieval world faded, childbirth remained a deadly frontier. It was not until the rise of antiseptics, anesthesia, and surgery in the modern era that the balance finally shifted. The deaths that once seemed inevitable became preventable. But in remembering this, we are forced to recognize how many millions of women walked into the birthing chamber never to walk out again. Their courage was quiet, their sacrifices unmarked by monuments, yet they sustained humanity through centuries of darkness. And perhaps that is the greatest tragedy of all, that their heroism was taken for granted. To bring life into the world while standing on the edge of death is an act more courageous than any battle fought by kings, yet their names remain largely unknown. In their pain, they forged the future. In their silence, they shaped history. The cradle and the grave were bound together, and every child who lived was a testament to a mother who had faced the abyss and either conquered it or was consumed by it. When we think of medieval childbirth today, it is tempting to imagine it as a relic of the past, something distant and detached from our lives. But the truth is that their suffering is part of the foundation of our existence. We are the descendants of survivors, the children of women who endured when so many did not. Every breath we take is a continuation of their struggle, every heartbeat a whisper of their endurance. To remember them is not simply to look back in pity, but to honor the resilience carved into the very fabric of humanity. So the story of medieval childbirth is not only a tale of blood and terror, it is also a testament. A testament to endurance, to faith, to the unrecorded courage of women whose bodies bore the cost of history. They faced death so that life could continue. They stepped into the chamber knowing they might not return, yet they went anyway, again and again, for centuries. And in that haunting truth, we see both the fragility and the strength of the human spirit, a reminder that behind the grandeur of history lies the quiet, unending sacrifice of mothers who gave everything so that we could exist at all.